Yeah, here we go. Look at that. Wednesday, November the 27th. Thanksgiving Eve to all of our friends in the United States of America. The big football games tomorrow, the big meal, then the door crasher sales on Friday, recovering on Saturday. And look at that. Thanksgiving has not even started, and Donald Trump has all of his ducks in a row. As I'm recording this, the Prime Minister of this country getting set to meet with the premiers across the country. We keep calling it a virtual meeting. It's actually a remote meeting. If it were a virtual meeting, we'd have all of those VR goggles on. They're going to meet by Zoom. It's a real meeting, but they're meeting remotely. Just, I know, picky, right? Anyway, all of this, of course, is in reaction to Donald Trump's declaration that he's going to slap us silly with tariffs. Oh, and everybody's terrified. You see what I did there? Anyway, we're going to talk a little bit more about that coming up in this program, this particular episode of Now and Next. What to expect? How did we get here? And, does he really intend to do what he said he's going to do? Yeah. And for those of you who think that it's just like 2016, no, it's not. You haven't been fucking paying attention if you think that's the case. So we'll get into that with a fella who knows a thing or two in terms of how it's all unfolding in the U.S. of A. And a new guest to the show, by the way. Yeah, first time caller, long time listener. A couple of things though I do want to tell you about, and some fun that's going on. You can see down on the scroll if you're watching on YouTube. I've got the connect with me on the social medias, and I've added in Blue Sky Social. I jumped in about a week ago or so, and I'm shocked at the number of folks who have found me, reached out, and we're creating this little community. And it does remind me of the early days of Twitter. So it's kind of fun to use. I'm not hung. I hate the letter count, but that's just me. But it is a little more tolerable. I'm not off Twitter. I'm on Twitter, still on our X. I'm on Facebook, Instagram, Thread, Blue Sky Social, LinkedIn. If you want to connect with me, do that at Dave Trafford is the handle. I'll get that out of me. A couple other things that you should know. Been very busy because I wanted to kind of beef up the presence of our website. So if you check out Story Studio Network, it's got to be the coolest site on the planet at storystudionetwork.com. Just fun. But in the meantime, I thought it was time to sort of give these two shows that I do a home on the interweb, and certainly Now and Next figures prominently there. And it's at Dave. It's davetrafford.com. It's not my email address, you idiot. So if you want to jump in, just check it out. And among other things, I post all of the shows that we do, both video and audio, on that page at Now and Next. And if you dip in there, you'll see that there is the talk back button. If you've got something to say, go to davetrafford.com, hit the talk back message button, and you're, 90% of the way into the show. We really do want to hear what you have to say. Some excellent comments on social media, certainly some thoughtful, not so thoughtful comments on the YouTube channel. It would be great for you guys to voice your opinion, and we'll include it in the show. I mean, don't be an asshole. Well, maybe we do want an asshole on the show. We'll just ridicule you from far. But yeah, there's some really thoughtful stuff that's going on. So jump in and let us know. Of course, the other opportunity there is you get to see what we're doing with On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast. And we had a sort of an interesting development in the last week. We did a soft launch, as we call it, for the program. On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast now airs Saturday mornings at 10 o'clock on News Talk 1010 in Toronto. And so it means that, if you didn't get a chance to hear the pod or whatever, you're out and about in the car, you can listen. and maybe you don't have the radio tuned to it because you're out of market, you're not in Toronto, I would suggest you, download the iHeart app, and you can listen anywhere. So it's good fun. And On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast, Saturday mornings, 10 o'clock on News Talk 1010. And maybe we'll have to put something up on davetrafford.com about the radio segment of the show. I'll be curious to know, how many of you would be listening on the radio on Saturday morning or through the app. Now, I should tell you, it's not the complete podcast. It is edited for time and F-bombs because, well, you can't say fuck on the radio, pretty much. Well, you could once, right? But you're not coming back. And so folks above me, in terms of those who run the station, would be saying, it's not worth it to get fired because Dave said fuck on the radio, right? And they're not going to let that happen. It's not a problem, but I'm just telling you, it's an edited version of what we do. On the Ledge, and of course that features Kathleen Wynne, Tim Hudak, Keith Leslie, John Wright, and I, and we've been at it now since 2018. Kathleen and Tim joining the show earlier this fall as we got the sessions going up again at Queen's Park. So we're having a good deal of fun. If you want to listen, there's no excuse for you not to be able to find that show, and away we go. Again, back to davetrafford.com, and all kinds of opportunity there for you to leave us your thoughts on what you like to hear and what's being said about the show or on the show or by the guests, etc. So, okay, so let's leave it there. And I do want to get into what is next, what's around the corner, as we prepare for the. Well, I think it's going to be a storm, no matter how you deal with it, because everybody said, well, we know what to expect from Trump. I don't think we do. Well, it's hard to believe. It's been 3 weeks, give or take, a day or so, since the final results, or the obvious results, let's say, not the final, because it took a while for all the ballots to be counted, came out. But the re-election of Donald Trump is in the rearview mirror by a good 3 weeks. And so I thought, let's let this settle, because the morning after was not necessarily the time to do this. It wasn't necessarily the best time to be kind of trying to figure out how, the whys, the whats, and the wherefores. 3 weeks out, okay, Trump has now made all of his appointments. He's got a cabinet. This is a completely different look in terms of what we saw in 2016, just because of the speed at which he has prepared himself to take office in the White House. So I thought, let's find out a guy who knows a thing or two about a thing or two south of the border. And Cliff Young is the president of polling and societal trends at Ipsos in Washington, and joins us. Welcome in. Thanks for being here.
It's great to be here, Dave.
I'm curious by the business card title, societal trends, and I realize that there's as much in terms of societal trend that went on in this election as there was in terms of the politics of the campaign. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I would say it's a little bit of both, right? And definitely this election in 2024 feels very different than the election in 2016 or 2020. And so there's something going on there. Obviously, short-term trends, throw the bums out, cost of living. I always call them Biden's inflation orphans. They either didn't show up to vote for Harris, or they voted for Trump, and so that's part of the story. And that's a cyclical story, right? We might be in a place in 4 years where those inflation orphans come back into the fold. But there are other trends going on, and I think most significant is that Trump put together an interesting coalition. So he had his base, and that base. We know the profile of that base. That base tended to be more rural, more white. They tend to be a little bit more nativist in orientation, meaning sort of like the favor native born over foreign born. That's been a story since 2016. But there are two other elements of that coalition. One of which I've already mentioned, these sort of inflation orphans, individuals that were impacted by inflation, that were frustrated by the administration, not recognizing that they had a problem. A lot of them were minorities, and you can see that in the exit polls, how minorities, Black Americans, Hispanic Americans, shifted in part towards Trump. And then you have a third sort of, I would say, segment that's very important. They tend to be more elite oriented. They're the tech bros. They're the podcast bros. They're individuals that are worried about the size of government, about the fact that the system is broken, and they need to take this system back from the establishment. Elon Musk represents that trend, Joe Rogan as well. So it's a very sort of interesting coalition, much different than 2016. And really today, I would say, or at least on the day after the election, we're really talking about a new and different America, an America that Trump represents, that's slightly different, obviously, than 2016.
So as I was listening to all of this kind of play out, and I'm always fascinated when I hear the prognostication prior to the election day itself, in terms of where the votes come from and how the votes are going to play out. And there's an emphasis in the United States on Latino and Black voters and et cetera. That is foreign to our language here in Canada. I mean, we wouldn't talk about that sort of racialized vote. And there seemed to be some surprise, as you point out, that we saw a shift in some of those demographics. How much is that changing your lens in terms of how you look at that you know layout, the actual landscape, when you're talking about where the votes reside? Is there any validity anymore, for example, in saying there is a Black vote?
I think that's a wonderful question, and I don't have a clear answer to that. I think that yes, America's changing. It's changing from a place where race was very important from identity standpoint. It really defined where you stood on the political fence. I wouldn't go as far as saying it's not still important, because you have 80, 85, 87, 88% of Blacks still voting for Democrats. As an example, yes, but we have a shifting America where the interests and the needs are really first, front and center. My ability to put food on the table and make ends meet is more important than whether you're a Democrat or Republican. I think that's what we're seeing specifically. My worry about America and where America is going is more important than whether you're a Republican or Democrat. I do think that's there's a shift going on. And ultimately we might still look at a racialized America because it's still there, but I think it's attenuating, and I think these sort of more systemic, more existential issues are more important for many Americans. And I'll give you an example, like the Latino vote, right? Which was never as strong as the Black vote in the United States for Democrats, but it trended and still does a Democrat. When you listen to Latinos in the border states, they had a very Trump mantle, or message to their sort of reflection logic. Like, my grandparents came here, they came here legally, they worked hard, no one gets a free lunch. The schools are inundated with illegal immigrants. The Democrats have forgotten about us. We need someone to take back the country and defend the borders. And we heard that. And that just kind of goes to my initial point, which is, these more existential issues, these more bread and butter issues um, seem to have trumped sort of the more identity-oriented issues in this electoral cycle.
So now read the tea leaves for me moving forward. I mean, I realize, and I take issue with the media who talk about, the pollsters blew it. You didn't get it right. You didn't get it right. And I keep slapping them up the side of the head and reminding them that this is not necessarily a predictive tool. It's a measure of what has happened in the moment you ask the question, for all intents and purposes. Can it actually lead to, give us an indication of what's to come? Sure. But to suggest that, you were going to have this was a completely 100% predictive. Having said all that, I want you to look forward. um, just given what you have described in terms of that societal trend, I guess is as good a way to put it as any, and that attention to survival in some cases. I mean, that's just what we're talking about. And now we look at the nature of this cabinet. We look at the first thing that Trump has said that really kind of caught fire is all about the tariffs. Certainly here in Canada, I know Mexico, China, everybody's paying attention to that. Where is that inflation orphan in there? Because to me, boom, that means prices are going up again.
Yeah, I mean well, let's step back a bit. And so talking about whether we can like look forward, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a question mark, right? To what extent are we seeing a shift? Are we seeing sort of a permanent realignment of the parties, where the Democrats are really the coastal elites together with the underclass, and the Republicans represent the middle and lower middle class? Is that a permanent shift, or is that just a pendulum swing because of inflation? So and I think that the Republicans probably are over rotating, and probably the Democrats are underemphasizing the shift. I think we're probably somewhere in the middle. I think a lot of this election was defined by the cost of living. But there is this sort of there's this widespread belief that ultimately the system is broken and it's not working for the average person. And Trump really sort of tapped into that zeitgeist at this point. And so going back to his government and sort of looking at his government, I would make the argument that his campaign represented perhaps the most populist campaign in the modern era. And I don't mean that in a pejorative sense. I mean that in a very technical sense. I mean that the policies were very or aligned with actually what people wanted. Whether people believe, know that tariffs will have an impact or not, that's not the issue. Whether it's a technically sweet policy, but that's what public opinion was saying, right? Americans want mass deportation. A majority of Americans say that. Whether that's a good policy or not, that's another issue. But Trump really represents sort of a very clear alignment between public opinion and his policies. Americans don't want to be in foreign wars. They're questioning after the forever wars whether it made any sense. We have an entire generation today of individuals that went off the war that are really questioning its merit. So again, I think that Trump and his cabinet picks really reflect, in a very raw way, what their base was saying. And what their base was saying is bring things back home, um, protect us, facilitate or help us put food on the table, make ends meet. That's what we want. And that's how I'm looking at it, Dave. I look at through that lens, and he's therefore very consistent in his cabinet picks, because his cabinet picks tend to be more populist in orientation.
Does that shorten the runway for him? Because he has set the expectations so high. He has delivered with such, I guess, aplomb, and he's been able to just with all kinds of speed and attention, and he's not backing down, so to speak. And I'm not suggesting that he should, but at the same time, his presidency pretty much started as soon as he put the final pen to paper to assign the final member of the cabinet, and it's not even Thanksgiving. So we're still. Does that 100 days in office actually get shortened in terms of the expectation and the runway for him?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I would just say, so historically speaking, whether we're talking about the United States or just, more globally, we know that governments have between 100 days and about 6 months. That's the period in which their approval ratings are the highest. They're most likely to get through their agendas. And I think he's very keenly aware of that right now. And he's already making moves, from a policy perspective, at least at a high level. You're looking at the issue of tariffs, for instance, specifically. He understands that he has that very short window. I would add to that is that we don't have experience with more populist oriented governments in the United States, once again, at least in the modern era. But we have a lot of experience in other countries with populist oriented governments, Latin America being one of the regions. Indeed, I spent 10 years in Brazil. I pulled all over Latin America. I knew it pretty well. And this sort of the trajectory of populist governments is basically they work until they don't work. And so, they work electorally really well because public opinion typically is policy agnostic. They don't care how it's done, they just want it done. I want to put food on the table. I want my kids to be healthy. I want to be safe walking in the streets. Please make that happen. I don't care how you do it. And it doesn't sort of kick in from a public opinion standpoint until you have a negative feedback loop. So this goes back to your initial question. What about tariffs and inflation, right? Will tariffs, cause inflation? Exactly that issue that he was trying to manage. We will see. I don't have a crystal ball, but the trajectory of populist governments is basically they work and they don't until they don't work, and when they don't work, they typically lose their coalition. Is that going to be the case in Trump's specific scenario or case? I don't know, but it's going to be interesting to sort of track it over the next year or so.
So where was the blind spot here? Because there were very few who would have, even who were leaning towards Trump being the better choice, who would have seen this sort of the depth of his mandate. Um, and we didn't get it in the media. And while the polling reflected a tight race, it didn't. I don't think it got down to what you talked about, granular at a very local level. And maybe that's just the nature of the Electoral College in the United States. He won all the swing states, the key states there. Where was the blind spot, do you think? Because the Democrats certainly had it, and some of the Republicans themselves had it.
Yeah, well, from a forecasting standpoint, not just a polling standpoint, the forecasting standpoint, I think a lot of the models were clearly showed that Trump had the advantage, and so Trump dominated the fundamentals. The fundamentals being the main problem. The main problem was cost of living. The candidate strongest on the main issue wins 85% of the time. Not all the time. There's 15% where they don't, but like he was in a strong position, historically weak incumbent. And Kamala didn't go through a primary, didn't have a popular mandate. So there were elements there ultimately that suggested that he was in a strong place. I think we told the story. I'm talking about the industry. I think we told the story fairly well. I think we talked about cost of living. We talked about widespread belief that the system is broken and a need for a strong leader to take it back. And that was very sort of. I think that was clear and it was measured in different ways. I don't think we put all the pieces together as clearly as we can see it now. And so, indeed, everything's so much clearer after it happens, right? So we talked about each of those elements. We talked about the cost of living. We talked about kind of systemic distrust and anti-establishment sentiment, right? We ultimately talked about what looked to be these inflation orphans and an attenuation among minorities relative to Biden, because we could really see that in his approval ratings. But I think putting it all together, we had the elements, but it wasn't so clear. But obviously, it's very clear now. And just going back to my initial point, it's a very popular mandate. It's a very populist mandate, and I think that his cabinet picks and his moves are just suggestive of that.
I wonder, and every time I talk to all my pollster friends, they're looking at this and they're deciding you've all got your own methodologies and you acknowledge each other's and so on. And the real science of the polling and the research that you do is critical in terms of how those numbers pop out. What have you learned from this? Because I'm assuming that you go back and you look at, okay, this is what we saw. We got this right. This is where we probably should have refined that, this, and the other thing. Does that affect your methodology moving forward?
There's two levels, right? And so, like analytically speaking, contextually speaking, I think we did, like I said, I think we did a pretty good job. I think we understood the broad trends. How they would manifest themselves was a little bit more uncertain, right? But we knew there was, as I said before, this anti-establishment trend. There was this, rejection of status quo because of inflation. We knew those elements were there, and so I think we did that pretty well. I think what where we need to reflect more as an industry is on our point estimate. And so what do I mean by that? So it's like actually what the poll says, right? So, will Trump win? Will Harris win? And obviously that's always a fuzzy measure, right? We're dealing with lots of different variables that are varying. But
But
ultimately,
I
if
dare say you're also dealing with a media that insists on that answer. That's
yeah,
the
but
problem too.
yeah, it's sort of a vortex that we can't get out of. And
Right. Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know, I've reflected a lot on how do you communicate uncertainty when uncertainty is not wanted, right? Everyone wants certainty. It's very difficult, Dave. It's an information vortex, right? But just going back to that, if you look at the global standard, the average error globally, 30,000 polls, 351 elections. It's an article actually that was published by some professors in Nature, so a peer-reviewed, well-regarded scientific journal. The average error is 2 per candidate. And in the United States, we did, the industry, did 1.5 at the national level and about 1.4 at the swing state level. I mean, we're well within that national standard. We're in the top 30%. Now, maybe that's a C, maybe that's a C plus, but it's not like we were super off. What I would say is we underwhelmed in terms of expectation. So there's an expectation that because we were saying as an industry 50-50, that one would expect the election to be exactly 50-50. And it wasn't. There was a slight trend towards Trump, and he kind of ran the board. And so we have had going into election night a certain perspective as an industry, and it didn't unfold like that. And that's always that's always problematic. But more importantly, I believe, and this is where we really need to work hard. We live in a very polarized society, one that's extremely distrustful of the establishment. By the way, us pollsters are part of the establishment in the minds of most, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
We're part of the problem. We're not part of the solution. You can hear that in podcasts all the time now. I just cringe when I hear those things on this side of the border. But ultimately, our problem is while we were 1.5 points off, that was our average error, which is good, which well within the average. It was systematically against Trump. We systematically underestimated Trump and overestimated Harris, whether that be at the national level or in the key swing states, and people can't distinguish between technical error bias and political bias. So if
Hmm.
we're off, we're cooking the books in people's minds. And I think that's the greater challenge that we have in a highly polarized, distrustful society. How are we credible messengers when people can't make that distinction? And
Well,
it's a
that's an
high bar.
important insight, though. I mean, that right to say just to say that out loud. That there's an acknowledgement in the industry that it leaned that way, one way or the other. And where was the bias? Now, my friend John Wright, the pollster, will tell you when you're explaining you've lost. So
No, no,
you're behind the
without a
eight ball.
doubt. I actually agree. I know John. I don't know John well, and he's great, and he's right. But at least long form podcasts, we can talk more, and that's a challenge that we have, right? And we only get to the point where we don't have that challenge when we don't have that bias, and
Hmm.
so it's a very high bar, but that's a bar we have to meet, actually, in my opinion.
Yeah, in a world where we're trying so desperately to get, based on fact, based on, the actual technique, the taking the bias out of it, and it doesn't matter whether it's media or polling. I said to John the other day, it's almost as if we're in a faith-based culture where it doesn't matter what the facts say. We always start a conversation like, well, I believe there is no such thing as, and I believe that this is what's going to happen, and I believe she's the better candidate. Everything's faith-based. It's not necessarily based on fact. So, trying to apply your rigor and logic and the technical insight to this, I get it. And on the media side, I got to think that most people who are covering the stories are doing the same thing. It's hard to fight against that I believe creed when it comes out culturally.
Yeah, and I think that we're in an extremely fractured information environment, right? Media environment, and so we have the mainstream media, which is under duress, right? We have a proliferation of other sorts of media, that have different sort of perspectives, and many of them anti-establishment perspectives. And that's this sort of the environment we have to navigate. And the only way to silence critics is to get it right. But we have to understand what right looks like. And like
Hmm.
my distinction between technical error and perceived political bias is actually the standard, I believe, in today's fractured world.
Yeah, and maybe it's my bias, but I would think that shouldn't be too hard to explain to people and move on. But clearly, there's people are still tripping over it.
Yeah, I just again, I think it just goes to a very well measured, by the way, by Ipsos, phenomenon, which is a widespread belief that the system is broken. By the way, it's not just the United States; it's in Canada. It's all over the world. We track it every year, and it's a problem. It's a problem for all of us, right? That are in some way or another established professions, in a world where people just disbelieve a lot of what's out there.
Yeah, I listened to Scott Galway on Pivot, the podcast, and he has some really interesting insights, and I'm curious to get your thoughts on it because he talks about he's leaning so far left he is in the Democrat elite world, and he admits it, but at the same time points out that they had a blind spot on the young men out there when the Democrats put up, "Hey, this is what we stand for," and he would go through the whole list that white men were not on that list, and it's easy to say, okay, that kind of is a easy low bar thing to criticize somebody over, but at the same time, he suggested that if you are in favor of supporting the 75% and not the 25%, how is it that you're not discriminating against the 25%? And so to me, it kind of, it just turned the lens around on all of that. And I go back to my question in terms of sort of the actual demographics of voting in the United States. You talked about the bro demo. All of a sudden that's come up. How how do you quantify those young men who are sitting in the basement because they don't have the opportunity, they don't have the societal or cultural support that we might have otherwise had when we were kids? um, is that an emerging force in the demographic in terms of overall voting? And how do you kind of measure that? Because he would say it extends not just from the young guy who doesn't have a job or is unstable in terms of his employment, but his parents who are also saying, get this kid out of my basement. I'm the one who wants opportunity as well. So there was a certain reflexive vote there for Trump as well that you might not have, we might not have otherwise seen.
Yeah, so this is a trend. This is a real trend. Um, it's a trend at Ipsos that we're seeing all over the world, all over the Western world, and so it's not just an American thing. Um, and it's political physics, right? For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. And so, I think there's a widespread feeling among certain segments of American constituencies, in the United States, including young men, that the establishment, that the system wasn't working for them. And how does that manifest itself? It's manifests itself in their minds, right? In DEI programs, in ESG programs, in like in woke sort of like policies, and woke sort of culture, and sort of anti-male sort of, and pro-female corporate policies. And so whether that's real or not, let's set it aside, but there's a real feeling of that. And in a democracy, you vote with your feet, right? And I think that's what in part of what we are seeing now. I don't want to overstate the victory, as a function of anti-woke politics. I think there's a lot of over rotation there. I think it was cost of living, and that's what really drove it ultimately. That kept a lot of people at home who would have otherwise voted for Harris. It drove some people over to Trump. Uh, but there is this other strain. We talking about this sort of, the bro thread, and I was talking more of it about at the elite level, right? Do we have a bifurcation of the elites in Silicon Valley? We're seeing that now. Elon Musk kind of represents that, but you have a more popular trend, especially with young men, that don't believe that the system works for them, right? And I think that's really something that, if you're a party or politician in the United States or in the West in general, is something you're going to have to contend with because it's real.
Yeah, I think that the next 4 years are going to be there's going to be just the political lane, but this coming to terms with how we got here over the last 4 years is going to be fascinating. So the books that will be written rather, I think in the next 15 years, mix COVID into all that. We didn't even talk about
We
that.
didn't
The
even do
effect.
that,
I
but
mean,
that's a big that conditioned a lot of what we're seeing.
entirely, yeah,
Yeah.
and I think that there was a certain fatigue from my perspective where we just didn't want to talk about that. We don't want to acknowledge it. We don't want to, deal with the reckoning that has come, and that's part of the cost of living. That's part of the being, shut in. All those sorts of things. I think it'll be fascinating to see where this all plays out. So for the next term of Trump, politically, it'll be one thing. That reawakening, um, culturally and politically for all stripes. I think it's going to be. I think you're going to be busy, Cliff.
Yeah, like unfortunately, the greater the uncertainty, the more we do.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. I was saying the other day. Well, we've solved the problem in the United States. There's no contesting the election, so all the lawyers had to stand down. But now we got the tariffs, so all the trade lawyers they're going to be busy. So
Oh yeah,
there
they're going to
there
be
was
super
always a
busy.
void, right?
Yeah, a little bit of angst up there on the other side of the border, north of the border, a bit on the tariffs.
Yeah, well, the prime minister is having a summit meeting with first ministers, the premiers today, just to kind of have a united front on it. And I think the mistake that they're making is saying it's just a negotiating ploy by Trump. We saw this game before. We heard him say what he was going to do, and now he's going to do it. I'm not. And maybe you have some insight, but I'm not convinced that we know exactly what Donald Trump is going to do.
I think that's fair. I think he goes into this, new administration feeling emboldened and strong. I think he learned in his first 4 years, and he knows the the leverage that the United States of America has really in the world, and I think he's going to throw it around. Now, what that means specifically for Canada, I think that's another question. But I think you have, I think any government is going to have to work with multiple scenarios. I think any government is going to have to think about bilateral deals. And the one thing I can say, we did a poll right before the elections, Americans' views of Canadians, and what we can say in the United States is that the American people have a very favorable opinion of Canadians. They see Canada as a critical security partner, as a critical economic partner. So the point being is you do have credibility in any sort of negotiations, and it should be used. But I do agree with you. There's a lot of uncertainty.
Yeah, and having said all of that, politically up here, it's unlikely that the current sitting prime minister is going to be the one who holds the pen on signing off on any new trade agreement. So that uncertainty at our side of it too kind of throws a wrench into
That
things.
might be better. I mean, I don't know. Yeah, but that might be. But a change of government might be better. Might make it easier. But ultimately, I think that Trump is going to be using the weight of the power of the United States in his favor. He recognizes that. I mean, he's dictating policy already. Um, uh, you know, by social media. So we're already seeing it.
Indeed. Cliff Young is the president of polling and societal trends at Ipsos. He works out of Washington, D.C. Thanks for joining us. Come back.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Dave.
Funny how sometimes we look at these, folks around, who are in our sphere and our circle, and how often I think we should know each other. Cliff and I had never met before we talked today, but we have followed each other fairly intently and closely online. So it was kind of an interesting conversation to have. So I'm definitely going to have him back to talk about more of what's developing and going on stateside. And he's got, again, some interesting insights into what's going on in Canada. And of course, he knows all the Ipsos guys up here. Daryl Bricker, Sean Simpson, of course, and as he mentioned, he knows our friend, our resident pollster, John Wright. If you've got some thoughts on that conversation, again, go to our talkback message. You'll find it on my website, davetrafford.com, and just go to the Now and Next page, click the talkback message button, and you are into the show. Otherwise, if you need to leave me a message, by all means, you can do so. Comments on the audio and the YouTube channel are excellent. Find me on social media. That works too. But we'd really like to get your voice into the show. Plenty of you got some really cool ideas, insights, complaints. By all means, leave them there. So go to davetrafford.com and leave your message for us here on the show. All right. Before we go, I just want to talk about and this is a dated issue. It's going to be in the next 3.5 weeks or so. We're getting ready to do a benefit concert for St. Clair Inn, and it's transitional housing here in Toronto for homeless women who struggle with mental health challenges. And this is a phenomenal support service that they provide, and it's all done without government money. And for a lot of cases where even some of the grants that are available to nonprofits, because of the kind of work they do and the commitment that they make, they don't get the money that other organizations get. They rely almost solely on fundraising. So we've stepped up. We're going to do a Christmas show. It's a show that I wrote. It's called The Promise. And we're running it on 3 shows on December 20 and 21st, 2 evening shows and a matinee. If you can at all help, that would be great. stclairin.com/events. I will put that link in the show notes to this show. If you're watching on YouTube, I've got the poster up there. There's a QR code. You know what? Just activate that QR code. It will take you directly to the page that describes everything we're doing, tells you all about St. Clair Inn, and you can buy the tickets. This is a family-friendly show. It's good for kids. I'm going to tell you, it's about the Christmas story. There's no Santa involved here. This is the real story of Advent, which the Christian church is just beginning to enter this weekend. Getting prepared for Christmas. The Christmas season, the 12 days of Christmas, by the way, comes after the 25th. And then the Epiphany. Yeah, that's the 3 wise men thing. Yeah, all of that stuff. So we tell the whole story with music. And it's a fun show. And it's really, I find it, not just from being able to perform it is one thing, but to do it in the service of St. Clair Inn, for me is great. And I think if you can go to the site and you can't come to the show, then make a donation. They can use that to support, and they can use your interest. And if you think about what goes on in this city, in Toronto, but it's not just Toronto, it's happening in cities right across the country, small towns. Homelessness is such a pervasive and insidious disease. We need to do something about it. So, I said it's the least I can do. And like I always say, I like doing the least I can do. So if you want to do the least you can do, yeah, step up, go to the website. Again, the link is in the show notes, and do the least you can do. Help us make room at the inn this Christmas for St. Clair Inn. All right, that'll do it for this week. Coming up next week on Now and Next, we've got our cast, our comms and strategy team, and that's always a fun time, so you won't want to miss it. In the meantime, subscribe to the channels. Make sure that they'll pop up with notifications so that you won't miss a thing, folks, and we'll make sure that we flag it all for you, and we're always grateful that you join us here on Now and Next. I'm Dave Trafford for Story Studio Network.
Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain.
Now and Next is Story Studio Network's flagship podcast, produced by our chief executive producer, Dave Trafford, and supported by our entire SSN team, including our senior producers, Becky Coles and Jen Hudson, our technical producer and audio editor, Mike Trutler. Jamie Nickerson is our production manager, and our sonic logo designer is Greg McDonald. Also, I'm Aaron Trafford. Queen of the universe.
And that's all I have to say about that.
Okay, everybody, that's a wrap.
This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.